but we're not happy with Venezuela for a lot of reasons.
He has not been good to the United States.
At around 4:17 a.m., a U.S. carrier strike group was moving steadily through international waters in the Caribbean, following a routine transit that looked, on the surface, no different from countless others carried out every year by the U.S. Navy. The sea was calm, visibility was limited by early morning darkness, and there were no distress calls, no warnings, and no signs of tension, which is exactly how freedom of navigation operations are supposed to look when they are unchallenged. That quiet balance broke suddenly when two Venezuelan patrol vessels emerged from the horizon and accelerated directly toward the projected path of the American formation, their speed and angle cutting across open water with clear intent, rather than coincidence. This was not the loose shadowing of a routine patrol, nor the distant observation typical of maritime monitoring, because the approach was aggressive, deliberate, and designed to apply pressure by positioning alone. In those first moments, before any commands were issued or decisions made visible, a question began to form that would shape everything that followed. Why would a smaller regional navy choose this narrow window before dawn to move decisively toward a U.S. carrier strike group in international waters? What happened next would turn a quiet transit into a test of discipline, judgment, and power at sea. And if you want to understand how moments like this unfold step by step, why each decision matters, and what it tells us about modern naval power, be sure to subscribe to Military Power so you do not miss what comes next. As the Venezuelan patrol vessels pressed forward, the distance between them and the American carrier group shrank to under 12 nautical miles, a range that carries heavy psychological and tactical weight for any large naval formation. At this point, a situation that might still be dismissed as distant monitoring transforms into a problem that demands immediate attention from commanders on the bridge. For ships the size of an aircraft carrier, space is time, and time is safety. A carrier moving at steady speed cannot turn sharply or accelerate away without advance planning. Every course adjustment requires coordination, engine response, and room to maneuver. When another vessel enters the 12 nautical mile envelope at high speed, those margins begin to disappear, reaction windows narrow, and the room for error contracts quickly, even if no weapons are visible. The Venezuelan approach made this reality impossible to ignore. Two patrol vessels were not slowing down, nor were they widening their spacing, as would be expected during routine observation. Instead, their speed remained high, and their formation stayed tight, signaling intent rather than uncertainty. This behavior matters because navies around the world follow shared patterns at sea, and experienced crews can read those patterns long before any words are exchanged. Equally important was the direction of travel. The Venezuelan ships did not drift across the carrier group's path by chance. Their headings aligned with the predicted route of the USS George Washington, placing them in a position that would force the American formation to either alter course or confront the closing geometry. In naval operations, controlling the angle of approach often matters more than raw speed, because the ship that claims the critical line can shape how the encounter unfolds. For an American audience, it is important to understand why the 12 nautical mile mark carries such weight beyond its legal meaning. At sea, this distance represents a point where decision-making shifts from planning to execution. Above it, commanders can observe, assess, and communicate with time to spare. Below it, choices must be made in minutes rather than hours, and hesitation can carry real consequences. This is why the Venezuelan maneuver was not treated as a navigational misunderstanding. High speed, tight formation, and precise alignment combine to create pressure without a single shot being fired. The message is delivered through motion and proximity rather than words, and it places the burden of response squarely on the ship being approached. At this range, even a small miscalculation can escalate a situation rapidly. Large vessels displace enormous amounts of water, and their stopping distances are measured in miles, not yards. When another ship crosses into that buffer zone, the laws of physics become just as relevant as the rules of engagement. The carrier group could not simply wait and see without accepting rising risk. Yet the most critical element of this phase was the time factor. By entering the 12 nautical mile zone at speed, 2 Venezuelan patrol vessels compressed the timeline for decision. The American commanders were forced to consider their options immediately, even though no hostile act had formally occurred. This is the essence of modern maritime pressure, where the goal is not to fire first, but to force the other side to move first. As the distance continued to close, the encounter shifted from a distant observation into a moment that demanded action. The numbers on the radar screens were no longer abstract. They represented shrinking seconds and narrowing space. What began as a calm transit now required deliberate choices, setting the stage for the response that followed. As the Venezuelan patrol vessels continued their approach, the American carrier strike group made a decision that was both visible and deliberate. The formation did not alter course, did not reduce speed, and did not signal any deviation from its planned transit through international waters. The USS George Washington maintained a steady pace, consistent with lawful navigation, reinforcing the principle that presence alone would not be enough to force a change in behavior. For large naval formations, consistency is a form of communication. By holding course and speed, the United States avoided creating ambiguity about its intentions. Any sudden maneuver could have been interpreted as hesitation or concession, especially in a region where maritime encounters are often shaped by perception as much as action. Maintaining the original transit profile kept the legal and strategic foundation of the operation intact. At the same time, the response was not passive. The destroyer USS Gravely was repositioned within the formation and began moving toward the projected intercept line of the Venezuelan vessels. This adjustment was measured rather than aggressive, placing the destroyer between the approaching patrol craft and the carrier without accelerating the encounter. In naval practice, this maneuver is often used to test intent by narrowing options rather than forcing contact. The presence of the Gravely changed the geometry of the situation. Instead of facing a single large target, the Venezuelan ships now had to account for a faster and more agile combatant positioned directly along their approach path. This created what naval planners often describe as a soft barrier, a positional response that raises the cost of continued advance without crossing into open confrontation. Above the surface, the situation expanded into the air. An MH-60R Seahawk helicopter lifted off and established a controlled orbit over the developing encounter. From altitude, the aircraft provided continuous visual coverage and electronic awareness, feeding real-time data back to the ships below. The helicopter did not close aggressively or signal an attack posture. Its role was observation, documentation, and presence. This layered response explains why the United States chose positioning and surveillance instead of direct engagement or withdrawal. Closing distance with the Venezuelan vessels could have escalated the situation unnecessarily, while retreating would have undermined the legal standing of the transit. Observation allowed American commanders to retain initiative, gather information, and shape the encounter without forcing an immediate crisis. Such decisions reflect a broader pattern in U.S. naval operations known as gray zone management. In these situations, actions are designed to influence behavior without triggering thresholds that lead to conflict. By combining steady surface movement with flexible air surveillance, the Navy created pressure through awareness rather than force. This approach also protects decision makers. Clear sensor data, stable formation control, and consistent navigation reduce the risk of miscalculation. They ensure that any change in the situation can be attributed to the actions of the approaching vessels rather than uncertainty on the American side. As the Gravely held its new position and the Seahawk continued its orbit, The carrier group preserved both freedom of movement and freedom of decision. The response sent a quiet but firm message that the United States was prepared to manage the encounter on its own terms. What followed would depend not on American movement, but on how the Venezuelan vessels chose to respond to a situation they could no longer control alone. Throughout the standoff, one fact remained constant. No weapons were fired, no fire control radar was locked onto a target, and no maneuver was made with the intent to provoke. This absence of overt aggression was not a sign of weakness. It was a deliberate choice, shaped by decades of naval experience and a clear understanding of how quickly missteps at sea can spiral into conflict. At the same time, readiness was visible in every detail of the American posture. Ship positions were precise and purposeful, with each vessel occupying a space that limited risk while preserving control. Angles of approach were calculated to maintain dominance of the surrounding waters without closing distance unnecessarily. Above the surface, air and sea assets worked together in a coordinated pattern that allowed constant awareness of the unfolding situation. This balance reflects a principle often described as deterrence by presence. The concept is simple in theory, but demanding in practice. A force signals its ability and willingness to respond, not through threats or force, but through calm, unmistakable visibility. By remaining steady and predictable, the United States communicated that it was prepared for any outcome while still leaving room for de-escalation. Deterrence by presence relies on shared understanding. Navies around the world recognize the meaning of disciplined formations, controlled speed, and layered surveillance. When these elements appear together, they convey readiness without crossing legal or tactical thresholds. The American carrier group did not need to announce its capabilities. Their posture spoke clearly on its own. Similar dynamics have played out in other regions where U.S. forces operate under pressure. In the South China Sea, American warships conducting lawful transits have often faced close approaches by regional patrol vessels. In the Persian Gulf, U.S. naval units have encountered fast-moving craft that test boundaries through proximity rather than attack. In each case, the response has followed a familiar pattern of restraint paired with awareness. These precedents matter because they show that escalation is not inevitable. By avoiding sudden moves and maintaining consistent behavior, the United States reduces the chance of misunderstanding. The focus remains on managing risk rather than asserting dominance through force. This approach protects sailors on both sides and preserves stability in crowded maritime environments. The message conveyed during the Caribbean encounter fits squarely within this tradition. The United States did not seek confrontation and took care not to introduce actions that could be misread as hostile. Yet it also refused to accept pressure that would alter a lawful course of navigation. The balance between restraint and resolve defined the response. For observers, the absence of dramatic action can be misleading. Readiness does not always announce itself through noise or motion. It often appears in the quiet confidence of a force that knows its position is legitimate and defensible. Every maintained heading, every controlled orbit, and every measured adjustment contributed to that message. This posture placed responsibility for the next move squarely on the approaching vessels. Without aggressive signals from the American side, any escalation would clearly originate elsewhere. This clarity is central to managing gray zone encounters, where the goal is to shape outcomes without triggering conflict. As the standoff continued, the significance of readiness without escalation became clearer. The United States demonstrated that it could project strength while preserving space for the situation to cool. The encounter was no longer about intimidation. It was about control, discipline, and the ability to hold firm without forcing a crisis, setting the conditions for the next phase of the confrontation. As the distance between the two formations narrowed to roughly 4 nautical miles, the encounter entered its most dangerous phase. At this range, naval officers no longer view the situation as routine proximity. it becomes a gray zone where physical limits, human judgment, and political consequence intersect. Every action begins to carry strategic meaning, even if no weapons are fired and no commands are spoken aloud. 4 nautical miles is not an arbitrary figure. For large vessels, it represents a point where reaction time collapses. A carrier group moving at steady speed has only minutes to respond to sudden changes ahead. Engine power, rudder input, and formation spacing must be coordinated instantly. There is little room for correction once that distance is crossed, especially in low light conditions before sunrise. As the Venezuelan patrol vessels pushed into this zone, their behavior became the central focus of attention. Their speed remained elevated, and their formation stayed compact, signaling persistence rather than caution. Small adjustments in heading and throttle were closely monitored because, at this distance, even slight movements can indicate intent. Each wake pattern and course alignment carried information that crews on both sides understood instinctively. The risk at 4 nautical miles is not limited to deliberate action. The danger of collision increases sharply due to the mass and momentum of naval ships. A carrier displaces tens of thousands of tons and cannot stop or turn quickly. A fast patrol craft, while smaller, can change direction rapidly, creating unpredictable crossing angles. One misjudged turn could produce a chain of events that neither side intends but cannot reverse. This proximity also magnifies the risk of misinterpretation. In crowded or tense waters, movements meant for positioning can be mistaken for hostile maneuvers. Radar tracks update rapidly, visual cues shift with the angle of light, and human perception becomes strained under pressure. Without clear separation, the margin between deterrence and escalation grows thin. Despite these risks, no shots were fired as the distance closed. The absence of gunfire did not reduce tension. Instead, it sharpened it. Silence replaced sound, and restraint replaced action, forcing commanders to rely on discipline and training rather than reflex. Each side understood that the next decision would shape not only the encounter, but how it would be interpreted far beyond the horizon. At this point, the encounter became less about movement and more about resolve. Holding speed, maintaining formation, or altering course even slightly could send a powerful signal. The stakes were no longer confined to the ships involved. Political leaders, regional actors, and global observers would eventually examine the outcome for signs of weakness or resolve. The 4 nautical mile zone is often where accidents become incidents and incidents become crises. History offers numerous examples of close maritime encounters that escalated because of miscalculation rather than intent. That awareness hung heavily over the scene as both formations pressed forward under growing strain. Tension reached its peak in this narrow band of water. With every passing second, the window for a calm resolution narrowed. The situation demanded restraint, balanced with readiness, patience, paired with control. It was a moment where calm nerves mattered as much as capability. As the formations held within this compressed space, the confrontation stood at a tipping point. The next move, however small, would determine whether the encounter eased or crossed into something far more serious, setting the stage for the decisive shift that followed. The turning point of the encounter came without noise or formal signal, but through a clear change in movement that every trained observer could recognize immediately. As the distance remained dangerously close, sensors and visual tracking confirmed that the Venezuelan patrol vessels began to reduce speed, easing away from the aggressive pace that had defined their earlier approach. In naval operations, speed is one of the most reliable indicators of intent. Unlike radio calls or flag signals, engine output and momentum cannot easily be disguised or explained away. When a vessel slows, it gives up pressure, shortens its ability to force outcomes, and opens time and space for the other side. For this reason, a reduction in speed is widely viewed as the first physical sign that an encounter is beginning to cool. The Venezuelan vessels displayed this shift clearly. Their wakes became shorter and less forceful, and the tight alignment that had kept them moving as a single unit started to loosen. The spacing between hulls increased, and their headings showed subtle divergence rather than strict coordination. These details may appear minor to casual observers, but to naval crews, they signal a meaningful change in posture. This moment also revealed the psychological weight carried by command decisions at sea. In any close standoff, the side that alters behavior first accepts the risk of being seen as the one stepping back. Commanders understand that even small adjustments can be interpreted as hesitation or reassessment. Choosing to slow down reflects a calculation that the risks of continuing forward now outweigh the potential gains. For Venezuelan leadership on scene, the decision likely followed a sober evaluation of conditions. The distance had entered a range where accidents could not be absorbed quietly. The American formation remained stable and disciplined, offering no visible opening. At that stage, continued pressure increased the danger of an incident that could escalate beyond anyone's control. Throughout this shift, the American carrier strike group made no visible changes. The USS George Washington maintained its heading, speed, and spacing, continuing along its lawful route without adjustment. Escorts held formation, and no attempt was made to exploit the Venezuelan slowdown. This consistency reinforced the legal and operational clarity of the American position. The contrast between the two sides became unmistakable. One formation adjusted its behavior, the other did not. In maritime encounters, this difference matters because it defines who is responding and who is setting conditions. The United States did not need to signal victory or assert dominance. Its steady posture spoke clearly enough. As the Venezuelan formation continued to loosen, the tension that had defined the previous minutes began to drain away. The risk of immediate collision decreased, and attention shifted from crisis management to controlled separation. What had been a test of resolve gradually transformed into a managed disengagement. This transition marked a tactical turning point in the encounter. Without gunfire, warnings, or dramatic maneuvers, the balance shifted decisively. The pressure that had driven the confrontation to its peak was gone. From this moment forward, the trajectory of the event was effectively set. The episode underscored a core lesson of modern naval operations. Outcomes are often shaped not by weapons, but by discipline, restraint, and timing. By holding steady while allowing the other side space to step back, the United States guided the encounter away from escalation. The Venezuelan reduction in speed was more than a mechanical change. It was the moment the confrontation began to unwind. That single decision reshaped the encounter and confirmed which side controlled the tempo, the space, and the final outcome of the standoff. As the encounter faded from immediate danger, the U.S. carrier strike group continued its transit without pause or adjustment. The USS George Washington maintained its course and speed through international waters, reinforcing a principle that sits at the center of American maritime strategy. Freedom of navigation is not asserted through statements or reactions, but through consistent action carried out under established international law. By proceeding as planned, the United States closed the encounter without signaling escalation or concession. This outcome sent a clear message to Venezuela. The episode demonstrated that attempts to apply pressure through proximity and timing would not compel a change in lawful behavior. The United States did not respond with force, yet it also did not yield ground. For regional observers, this balance carried meaning beyond the immediate incident. It showed that presence and discipline can neutralize provocation without opening the door to conflict. The message extended across the Caribbean. Sea lanes in this region remain vital for commerce, energy movement, and security operations. Any effort to redefine access through intimidation risks broader instability. By holding its line, the United States reaffirmed that these waters remain open and governed by shared rules rather than unilateral claims. This reassurance matters to allies and partners who rely on predictable maritime norms. At the same time, the episode clarified American intent. The United States does not seek confrontation in the Caribbean or elsewhere. Escalation would undermine regional stability and impose costs that no side benefits from absorbing. Yet restraint should not be mistaken for reluctance. The encounter showed that American forces are prepared to manage pressure calmly and decisively when challenged. This distinction between avoiding conflict and controlling it defines modern U.S. naval posture. Commanders are trained to absorb provocation without overreacting, while maintaining readiness to respond if necessary. The ability to hold this balance is what allows the Navy to operate in crowded and contested spaces without turning routine encounters into crises. Looking ahead, it would be unrealistic to assume that such encounters will disappear. Gray zone challenges are likely to continue as regional actors test boundaries, seek attention, or respond to domestic pressures. Close approaches, symbolic gestures, and attempts to influence behavior through proximity may recur, especially in strategically sensitive waters. However, the recent encounter offers a clear template for managing these moments. Consistency, visibility, and discipline reduce the risk of miscalculation. They also place responsibility for escalation squarely on those who choose to push beyond accepted norms. Over time, repeated demonstrations of this approach shape expectations and discourage reckless behavior. From a strategic perspective, the balance of maritime power in the Caribbean remains unchanged. The United States retains unmatched capacity to project force, maintain awareness, and sustain operations over distance. More importantly, it continues to demonstrate the judgment required to use that power responsibly. The conclusion of this episode was quiet by design. No statements were issued at sea, and no dramatic gestures followed. The carrier group moved on, and the situation stabilized. Yet the message lingered. On today's oceans, control is often exercised without confrontation. By holding steady, the U.S. Navy reaffirmed its role as the anchor of maritime stability, signaling that while challenges may arise, the advantage at sea remains firmly in American hands. Control at sea today is shaped by discipline, timing, and restraint, not just firepower. Share your thoughts and subscribe to Military Power, where we break down the forces, decisions, and strategies shaping the world's most serious confrontations.